Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The late afternoon sun in Silver Creek threw sharp light across the street, bleaching the boards of the storefronts and lifting fine dust into the air every time a wagon rolled by. At the far end of town, doors had already been slammed shut one after another against the same figure, an Apache woman with road dust in her hair, grime on her arms, and eyes that carried both exhaustion and defiance. Her name was Nalin, though no one in town had asked. For 2 days, she had walked with little food and less water, pushing herself forward because turning back meant nothing but emptiness. She carried 3 wrinkled dollar bills in her pocket, the last of what she had managed to keep. All she wanted was to wash, to strip the grit from her skin so she could feel human again. But each knock had been met with either silence or blunt rejection. By the time she reached the last house at the edge of town, the fatigue had soaked into her bones. Her mouth was dry, her hands trembled slightly, but her back stayed straight. This house was different. It stood alone, with a corral stretched out beside it and a shed in back. No children ran in the yard. No voices called from inside. The place looked tended but quiet, like it belonged to a man who kept his own company. Nalin hesitated for a moment, knowing this might be her last chance. She lifted her hand and knocked firmly. Inside, Reed Walker heard the sound and froze in place. He hadn't had many visitors in the years since his wife, Martha, had died of fever. He had stayed in a house on the edge of Silver Creek because he didn't know what else to do, working the corral, mending fences, and going to town only when he had to. Silence had become his routine, and he carried it like a second skin. When the knock came, his first reaction was suspicion. Men from town rarely came without purpose, and strangers were even less welcome. Reed opened the door with caution. What he saw startled him enough to keep his hand on the frame. A woman stood there, dust caked in her dark hair, sweat streaked across her temples, and travel-worn clothes clinging to her shoulders. Despite her state, she stood upright, her eyes steady on his. Her voice was low and hoarse, scratched from dust, but it didn't waver. "I have $3, she said. "I only need a wash." Reed's throat tightened. He felt an old discomfort, something between wariness and a memory of kindness he hadn't practiced in years. He looked at the woman's face, then at her hands, which trembled slightly though she tried to hide it. He thought of the townsfolk who would not have spared her a word, let alone a drink of water. He also thought of the risk, taking in an Apache woman when half the town still measured her people as enemies. The moment stretched. The floorboard beneath his boot creaked as his weight shifted. Reed's mind raced. If he let her in, there could be talk in town, maybe worse. But if he turned her away, she might collapse not far down the road, and he would know he had done nothing. His late wife had always pressed him toward decency, even in small acts. That voice came back to him now, and he felt the shame of hesitation. Finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. His tone was flat, but not unkind. Nalin's shoulders eased just slightly, though her face stayed composed. She stepped inside, scanning the room quickly, taking in the iron bed with its neatly folded blanket, the table cleared but worn, the shelf where a woman's apron still lay folded. She noticed these things, but kept silent. The air smelled faintly of lye and wood smoke, the marks of a house still maintained, but heavy with the absence of its former warmth. Reed moved toward the stove, reaching for the kettle. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "There's a basin. I'll heat some water. Soap and towels are on the sideboard." Nalin nodded once. The tension in her chest loosened enough for her to breathe deeply. She placed the 3 crumpled bills on the table, not as a gift, but as proof that she wanted no charity, only a chance. Reed glanced at them, but said nothing yet. His jaw worked slightly as he set the kettle to boil. For the first time in years, the house carried the sound of 2 people moving in it, and both of them knew something had shifted, though neither spoke of it. Reed carried his grief quietly. Nalin carried her hunger and dust just as silently. Now, under the same roof, they both felt the weight of a decision that had brought them to this moment. Him to open the door, her to knock one last time. The kettle began to rattle on the stove, steam pushing at the lid, and Reed lifted it with a cloth and poured the water into the tin basin, then added a dipper of cold from the barrel to take the edge off the heat. The basin sat on a wooden table near the window where the light was still strong, showing every speck of dust floating in the air. Reed's movements were deliberate, his hands steady but his jaw tight, as if he were bracing against memories that threatened to rise. He placed a bar of lye soap and 2 towels beside the basin, then stepped back, unsure of what else to say. Nalin watched him quietly, her face unreadable but her thoughts racing. The silence of the cabin was heavy, carrying not only the smell of wood smoke and boiled water, but also the faint presence of a woman who no longer lived there. She had seen the apron folded neatly on the shelf, the kind of thing a man would not keep unless it belonged to someone he still mourned. She wanted to ask who the woman had been, but knew the question would cut too deep. Instead, she kept her focus on what she needed most: clean skin, a moment of relief, and the chance to hold on to her dignity in a town that had stripped her of it with every slammed door. She unpinned her hair, shaking out a curtain of black strands that spilled down past her shoulders, heavy with dust. She dipped her hands into the basin, the warm water clouding as she scrubbed her palms and face. The sting of the soap made her eyes water, but she did not stop. Reed stood near the stove, arms crossed, watching the way she worked with quiet determination. He realized then that she wasn't just washing off dirt. She was fighting to reclaim something the road and the townsfolk had tried to take from her. When she reached her shoulders and could not bend her arms enough to reach her back, she turned slightly, her voice low and steady. "Could you help with this part?" Reed's body tensed. His hand hovered in the air for a moment before he moved forward, taking the rough towel. He hesitated, staring at her back as though it were something forbidden. His wife had been the last person he'd touched with such care, and the memory of it tightened his chest. But the sight of Nalin's skin, marked by dust and faint bruises from travel, pushed him past his reluctance. He placed the towel against her shoulder blade and scrubbed gently, working downward with firm, practical strokes. The room was silent except for the sound of cloth against skin and the faint drip of water back into the basin. Nalin kept her gaze on the wall, feeling his hand move with restraint, but also with a strange kind of steadiness. She thought of how close she had come to collapsing on the road that morning, and now here was a man who, despite his own hesitation, was giving her the help no one else would. Her chest tightened with something she didn't want to name yet. When Reed set the towel aside, the basin water was the color of mud. He stepped back, his face unreadable, but his shoulders stiff. She wrapped herself in the other towel, drying her arms and hair with slow, careful movements. Reed carried the basin to the back door, dumping the dirty water onto the dry ground where it sank quickly into the dust. For a moment he stood outside, breathing in the sharp air, fighting the thought that he had just let someone into his home in a way that would change everything. Inside, Nalin dressed again in her worn clothes, though now they felt different against her clean skin. She gathered the $3 bills from the table and pushed them toward him. "I keep my word," she said. Reed stared at the money, then at her. His first instinct was to take it because payment meant boundaries, meant this was just a transaction. But something about the way she stood, shoulders squared, eyes steady, reminded him that she wasn't asking for pity. She was demanding to be treated with respect. Still, his own sense of decency stirred, and he slid the bills back across the table. "Keep it," he said. "Water and soap aren't worth $3. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Pride kept her from thanking him. Instead, she said, "Then I'll work for it. I can sweep, scrub the basin, hang the towels." Reed gave a slow nod, surprised by how easily he agreed. For years he had done everything alone, yet the sight of someone else moving through the cabin didn't feel as wrong as he thought it would. He pulled the broom from the corner, set it against the wall, and left her to the task. As she worked, bristles scraping the floorboards, tin basin clattering under her hands. Reed sat at the table, silent, his mind turning over the same question. Why had he opened the door? Fear had been his first response, followed by doubt. But when she stood there, tired and proud, he had felt something stronger than caution. He had felt the weight of what would happen if he chose not to act, and the thought had been heavier than any risk. By the time the towels were pinned outside and the basin shone dull in the light, Reed realized the house didn't feel as empty as it had the day before. The silence remained, but it no longer pressed down on him. It carried a different weight, one that belonged to two people instead of one. The air outside carried the smell of dry sage and dust, the kind that never left Silver Creek no matter the season. Nalin stepped back into the cabin after hanging the towels, her hands rough from work but her face calmer. Reed sat at the table, shoulders hunched, as though still weighing whether he had made a mistake in opening his door. The silence between them was not hostile, but it was thick, the kind that made each sound stand out. The scrape of a chair, the soft crack of the firewood shifting in the stove. Nalin finally broke it. "You didn't ask why I was knocking on doors." Reed lifted his eyes, slow and cautious. "Didn't figure it was my place." She studied him a moment. People usually ask. They ask before they shut the door. Reed said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw gave her the answer. He already knew the town. He knew how they looked at her, and why she hadn't found a welcome anywhere else. "I came from the River Post," she continued, her voice level but tired. "There was a fire, too many men drinking, too many guns. The post burned in a night. Family scattered. I had a cousin nearby, but I lost the trail in the storm 3 days back. I walked here because I thought a town meant water and work." She let out a dry laugh that held no humor. Turns out it only meant locked doors. Reed absorbed her words in silence, his hands resting flat on the table. Part of him wanted to ask why she hadn't kept walking, why she risked coming to a town that would never forgive her people for the wars of the past decade. But the other part of him, the heavier part, already knew the answer. When you had nowhere left to go, you stopped at the first door that opened. "You've been alone on the road?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "Before that I worked near the post, cooking, cleaning. It wasn't much, but I could trade for what I needed. Since the fire, I've had nothing but what I carry. And $3. Her tone sharpened slightly, as if reminding him she had tried to pay her way from start. Reed nodded slowly. He looked down at the table where the bills still lay, edges curled from wear. He thought about how many hands had likely passed them along, and how it had taken her walking through half the desert just to find someone who wouldn't take them. For the first time, he let out a breath heavy with more than words. "Silver Creek's not kind to strangers, and less kind to your people. You know that." "I know," she answered without hesitation. Her gaze stayed on him, steady. "But you opened the door." That truth sat between them, undeniable. Reed felt the old pressure in his chest again, the mix of guilt, grief, and something like obligation. He hadn't meant to carry anyone else's burden after Martha died. For 3 years, he'd lived with his routines. Mend the fence, tend the mare, patch the roof, eat plain meals at the table. He never thought to change any of it. But now, in less than an hour, this woman had unsettled that silence. To break the weight of it, Reed stood and walked to the stove. He pulled out a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a jar of dried beans. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice flat but carrying more concern than he meant to show. Nalin's eyes flickered with relief, though her posture stayed composed. "I can eat, but let me earn it. I'll work for food." "You already worked," he said, nodding toward the swept floor and the basin gleaming in the corner. She shook her head. "That was for the water. A meal deserves more." Reed almost argued, but the stubbornness in her tone stopped him. He set the bread and beans on the table anyway, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated, then took the chair across from him. The meal was plain, hard-crust bread and beans boiled soft, but when she bit into it, her jaw tightened against the simple relief of eating after days of hunger. Reed ate quietly too, watching her without making it obvious. The fire cracked. Outside, a coyote yipped once in the distance, then faded into the night. When the meal was done, Nalin spoke again, her tone measured. "If I stay, even for a day, will the town come knocking at your door?" Reed leaned back, his arms crossed. He considered the question, the risks. "They'll talk," he admitted. "They'll talk plenty. Some might try to stir trouble. But Sheriff Pike, he's fairer than most. Long as there's no fight, he won't put his hand in it. And I don't answer to the storefront gossips." Her eyes softened slightly, the first sign of trust since she'd arrived. Then I'll stay until morning. After that, we'll see. Reed gave a slow nod, though inside he felt the weight of what morning might mean. He didn't know yet if he wanted her gone or not. What he did know was that his house no longer felt like just a shell filled with memories. It felt unsettled, alive in a way that was both unsettling and not unwelcome. That night, he laid a spare blanket on the pallet near the stove. "You'll be warm enough here," he said. She accepted it without a word, lying down with her hands folded on her chest, her breathing evening out as exhaustion pulled her under. Reed sat on the step just outside the door, staring into the dark pasture, the mare shifting in her stall, the wind carrying dry dust across the yard. He asked himself the question again. Why had he opened the door? But no answer came, only the quiet knowledge that he had, and that had already tied him to something larger than he had planned. Morning brought a sharp chill that cut through the gaps in the cabin's walls. The fire in the stove had died down to ash, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air. Reed woke first, moving with the quiet steps of a man used to living alone. He found Nalin still asleep on the pallet, one arm folded across her chest, the other resting by her side. Her breathing was steady, but her face carried the tightness of someone who never truly let her guard down, even in rest. For a moment, Reed watched her, uncertain if he should feel uneasy or relieved that she had spent the night under his roof. When she stirred awake, she sat up quickly, eyes scanning the room as if to confirm she was still safe. Reed offered her coffee, black and bitter, poured into a tin cup. She accepted it, her hands wrapping around the metal to draw in the warmth. The silence between them carried weight, but it wasn't empty. It was full of questions neither of them had asked yet. After the meal of beans and bread left over from the night before, Reed stepped outside to check the yard. The mare shifted restlessly in her stall, ears twitching. Beyond the corral, dust drifted from the town road. Two men stood near the general store, their hands in their pockets, talking low while glancing in the direction of the Walker place. Reed had noticed them the evening before, loitering with nothing to do. He knew the look. They were spreading word already. By mid-morning, the town's gossip had made its way to Sheriff Ezra Pike. Pike wasn't a man to waste time on rumors, but Silver Creek was small, and when a stranger showed up, an Apache woman, no less, the council expected him to pay attention. Pike saddled his horse and rode slow toward the edge of town, not rushing but not ignoring either. His presence was meant to calm talk before it boiled over. Reed was repairing a loose hinge on the yard gate when Pike rode up. The sheriff dismounted with the steady gait of a man who had seen more disputes than he cared to count. His voice was calm but direct. "Morning, Reed. Heard you've got company." Reed stood straight, the hammer still in his hand. "You heard right." Pike's eyes flicked past him, catching sight of Nalin near the wash line, pinning up the towel she had used the night before. She looked back at him, her face calm, neither hiding nor challenging. Pike tipped his hat in her direction, then turned back to Reed. "Some folks are uneasy," Pike said. "They think trouble follows where it isn't wanted." Reed's jaw tightened. "She asked for water. That's all. I don't see a law against it." "There isn't," Pike answered, his tone even. "I just need to make sure this doesn't turn into something bigger. You know how this town gets when folks don't understand a thing. They talk it into a fire." Reed set the hammer down and looked the sheriff square in the eye. "I opened my door because no one else would. She's not causing trouble. If anyone comes here looking to start it, that's on them, not her." Pike studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. He had known Reed for years, had seen him sink into silence after Martha's death, and he respected the man's stubborn sense of right and wrong. "I'll tell folks I checked in. That should cool things down. But if someone does push, you come to me first. Don't handle it on your own." Reed gave a short nod. "I hear you." The sheriff mounted his horse again, tipped his hat once more toward Nalin, and rode back to town, his figure shrinking against the dry horizon. When Reed turned back, Nalin was standing near the wash line, her hands still on the clothespins. "You think the town will leave it at that?" she asked. "No," Reed said honestly. "They'll talk more before they talk less. But Pike's a fair man. He won't let them push past words." Nalin's face showed no fear, only the guarded look of someone who had lived her life under suspicion. I've heard talk before. Words don't break skin, but they can make a man forget his own judgment. Reed knew she was right. He had seen it himself. How rumor could turn men foolish faster than whiskey. He felt a flicker of something in his chest then, not quite fear, but responsibility, the weight of having let her in and knowing the town would not forgive it easily. That evening, after chores were done and the last light faded from the sky, Nalin sat by the stove, mending one of Reed's old work shirts. Her hands were quick and precise, the needle moving with practiced efficiency. Reed sat across from her, staring at the fire, the day's exchange with Pike running through his mind. He wondered what Martha would have said if she had seen this moment. An Apache woman in their home, stitching his shirt while the town whispered outside. He couldn't answer that, but what he did know was simpler. The house no longer felt empty, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a weight he had to carry alone. The next morning, Reed stepped outside before the sun cleared the ridge. The air was cold, the kind that made breath hang white in front of him. He carried the feed bucket to the corral, listening to the steady thump of hooves as his mare shifted impatiently. When he glanced back at the cabin, he was surprised to see Na Lin already awake, sleeves rolled, drawing water from the pump. She had tied her hair back, her movements brisk and efficient. And for a moment Reed just watched, realizing she knew how to work as if she belonged on land like this. "Pump squeaks," she said over her shoulder without looking at him. "Leather washers cracked. I can cut a patch from a strap." Reed raised an eyebrow. "You've done that before?" "Plenty," she answered simply. "My uncle kept a line camp near the hills. Nothing worked unless we fixed it ourselves." That detail caught Reed off guard. In town, people assumed all Apache lived wild, moving from place to place. The truth was sitting in front of him now, a woman who had spent years doing the same hard labor any ranch hand would, probably better than most. He nodded slowly. "Straps in the shed. We'll patch it after chores." The morning passed with quiet labor. Reed repaired a sagging fence rail while Na Lin hauled buckets, her arms steady, her back straight. When he looked over, she was checking the mare's hoof, running her fingers along the frog and heel with the calm skill of someone who knew animals. The mare, usually restless with strangers, stood still under her touch. Reed felt a twinge in his chest, part surprise, part respect. Inside, the house had changed too. Na Lin had swept again, stacked kindling by the stove, even washed Reed's tin cups without being asked. He hadn't realized how much of the place had grown into quiet neglect until she moved through it with steady purpose. For years, he had lived with dust that never got cleared, hinges that squeaked, things left undone because it was easier to leave them that way. Now each task she touched made the house feel less like a grave and more like a home. Later, over a simple meal of bread and coffee, Na Lin finally asked what had lingered between them since she'd arrived. "Why do they watch you different in town? You don't carry yourself like a man they'd ignore." Reed looked up from his cup, caught off guard. "You've been here 2 days, and you already noticed that." "I noticed things," she said flatly. He took a long breath before answering. "I was the one they used to lean on. Before Martha died, folks came here for help with stock, with water, with whatever needed steady hands. After she passed, I stopped going into town except when I had to. People don't like when a man pulls back. They take it personal, like you turned your back on them." He set the cup down, his eyes fixed on the table. "Truth is, I didn't have anything left to give." Na Lin studied him, her face softer now. She didn't say she understood, but the silence that followed carried agreement. She too had lived with the pull of loss, her people scattered, family lines broken. She knew what it meant to be measured by what you had already lost instead of what you still carried. By afternoon, word of her presence spread further. A wagon driver stopped on the road by Reed's fence, squinting at the yard before moving on without a word. Later, the storekeeper brought out the sack of oats Reed had ordered weeks earlier. His eyes lingered on Na Lin as she stacked firewood, but he kept his mouth shut, only muttering about prices going up. Reed noticed, though, and so did Na Lin. When the man left, she asked plainly, "Will they make trouble for you because of me?" Reed shook his head, though his voice was firm. "I don't live by their comfort. Let them talk." That night, After the chores were finished and the fire warmed the cabin, Nalin sat at the table, mending one of Reed's torn work shirts. Her fingers moved quickly, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Reed watched from the other side, not sure if he should speak. The questions pressed at him. Where was her cousin now? What had she really left behind when she came north? But he kept them to himself, sensing that she would answer in her own time, not when pressed. Instead, he asked something simpler. You planning to move on once you're rested? She didn't look up from the needle. I plan to, but plans don't always hold. I'll stay until your fence and pump are right. After that, I'll decide. Reed leaned back in his chair, studying her. He felt the weight of that answer. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't an ending either. The thought that she might leave brought a dull ache he didn't expect. He realized, for the first time since Martha's death, that the idea of being alone again carried more fear than comfort. As the fire burned lower, the cabin settled into quiet. For Reed, it was a silence that felt different now. Not the heavy emptiness he had lived with for years, but a silence shared, alive with the presence of someone who had earned her place not by asking, but by working alongside him. And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he hoped the morning would not be the last time he heard her moving around his yard, mending what he had left broken. The sun was already high when Reed and Nalin set to work on the pump. The squeak from the handle was louder than ever, grinding with each pull, and Reed had left it too long out of habit. Now Nalin crouched beside the iron shaft, prying loose the worn leather washer with a steady hand. She cut a strip from an old harness strap, her knife strokes quick and clean, and fitted it in place before Reed even fetched the nails he thought they'd need. When she tested the handle again, the pump drew water smooth and quiet, the bucket filling clear. Reed stood with his hands on his hips, shaking his head. You just fixed something I'd been living with for months. You didn't fix it because you lived alone, she answered simply. When you're alone, you put up with things. When you're not, you mend them. Her words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He turned away, carrying the full bucket to the trough, but the truth of it followed him. By midday, they had moved on to the corral. Reed showed her the fence line where rails had sagged and posts leaned from years of wind. Together, they lifted the rails back into place, hammered pegs until the wood held firm, and patched gaps with split boards. Nalin worked without complaint, sweat streaking her temples, her hands blistering against the hammer handle, yet she never slowed. Reed noticed the difference. Most ranch hands would grumble or demand more pay, but she worked with the focus of someone proving she belonged. Inside the house later, she mended tack with neat, precise stitches. Reed watched her from the table as he sharpened a knife. The silence felt different now. No longer heavy but steady, each sound purposeful. The scrape of the blade on stone, the pull of thread through leather. He caught himself thinking that the cabin hadn't felt this alive since Martha was there, though in a different way. That evening, Reed saddled his horse for a trip into town. Nalin stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. You're going for supplies? Flour, tobacco, and nails, he said. People will see me if I go with you. They've already seen you, Reed replied. His tone was flat, but his jaw was set. Might as well let them get used to it. In town, the reaction was immediate. As they walked down the boardwalk toward the general store, a woman pulled her child close, whispering sharp words under her breath. A ranch hand leaning against the livery muttered something Reed didn't catch, but the tone carried. Reed ignored it, his eyes forward, but he felt the weight of each stare. Nalin walked beside him, her shoulders squared, refusing to look away. Inside the store, the keeper weighed out the flour without comment, though his hands moved stiffly. He slid the sack across the counter and glanced at Nalin, but said nothing. Reed placed the money down hard enough to end the moment. On their way out, Sheriff Pike stepped off the boardwalk, arms crossed. He looked from Reed to Nalin, his expression unreadable. Counsel's been on me, he said. They wanted to ask if she's staying. Reed straightened. She's working at my place. That's all they need to know. Pike's eyes shifted to Nalin, who met his stare calmly. If you're going to stay, better to have it on paper. A name, a role. Otherwise, they'll talk themselves into trouble. Reed clenched his jaw. You mean a record? Call what you want, Pike replied. It's not the law, but it settles nerves. A paper in my office says you're a worker at the Walker Ranch. Then if anyone stirs trouble, I can shut it down. Nalin looked at Reed, then back to the sheriff. Her voice was firm. Write it. I'm not afraid of being named. They signed a statement at Pike's desk, plain words on a single page. Nalin Walker, listed as stable hand and laborer. It wasn't much, but it made her more than a shadow. When they left the office, the stairs on the boardwalk had shifted, not gone but quieter, as if paper had turned whispers into something less dangerous. That night, back at the cabin, Reed set the signed paper on the shelf where Martha's apron had been. He looked at it a long time, then closed the shelf door without saying anything. Nalin, sitting by the stove, pretended not to notice, but inside she felt the shift. The house was no longer just his. She had put her name in it, and neither of them could deny what that meant. The next day began like any other, with the two of them working side by side in the yard. Reed was checking the corral rails when the wind picked up suddenly, tearing a loose sheet of tin from the shed roof. It clattered across the yard with a sharp, metallic scream, spooking the mare in her stall. The animal bolted through the open gate before Reed could grab the latch. Her hooves pounded hard against the packed earth until her front leg struck a buried rock. She stumbled, let out a strained cry, and limped badly before Reed managed to get a rope around her neck and slow her down. Nalin was already running, her braids swinging against her back. She crouched beside the mare, her hands steady, her voice low and calm. "Easy, girl, easy." Her palms moved along the trembling leg, fingers pressing into the tendon, sliding down toward the hoof. Reed knelt opposite her, watching closely. The mare's breath came in fast, panic bursts, ears flicking back. She hit the fetlock hard. Nalin said, her tone clipped but calm. "Might be sprained. No break. She'd be down if it was." Reed nodded, though his chest tightened. That mare was more than stock to him. She was the last piece of the life he had built with Martha. Losing her would feel like losing what little he still had left. He grabbed a rag, dipped it in the water trough, and handed it to Nalin. She pressed it gently against the swelling, then reached into the small bundle she kept in the cabin. From it she pulled a length of cloth, worn but strong, and began wrapping the leg with slow, practiced turns. Reed watched in silence, surprised by how sure her movements were. "You've done this before?" "My uncle bred ponies," she answered without looking up. "We tended to every injury with what we had. There's no doctor on the plains." Reed's respect deepened. He had taken her in thinking of her as a burden the town would scorn, but in this moment she was the one holding his world steady. The mare settled under her touch, breathing slower, eyes less wild. Nalin stroked her neck, whispering something Reed couldn't catch, words from a language he didn't know but understood all the same. When they finally led the mare back into the stall, spreading fresh straw under her legs, Reed leaned against the rail and let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His shirt clung to him with sweat, though the day was only just warming. He looked at Nalin, who wiped her hands on her skirt and stood straighter, her face calm, but her shoulders tense with the effort. "You saved her," he said, the words heavier than he intended. Nalin shook her head. "I just gave her a chance to heal. The rest is up to time." Reed nodded slowly, still watching her. He felt something shifting inside him, not just gratitude, but the realization that her presence had already become part of the rhythm of his days. The house, the yard, even the animals seemed different with her there, less fragile, less weighed down by silence. That evening, after chores were finished, Reed sat on the porch while Nalin prepared a small meal inside. The mare shifted softly in the stall, the sound steady and alive. Reed thought of the sheriff's warning, of the whispers in town, and of what it would mean if Nalin stayed. He knew the talk would not fade quickly, but when she stepped out with 2 plates, setting one in front of him without a word, he realized the choice was no longer about the town. It was about what he wanted his life to be, empty and quiet, or shared, even if it brought trouble. Over the meal, Nalin spoke in her calm, deliberate way. "You asked yourself if it was a mistake letting me stay." Reed met her eyes. "I did. And now?" He hesitated, then spoke plainly. Now I call it the first good decision I've made in years." Her gaze softened, though she didn't smile. Instead, she nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth she had already sensed. The fire inside the cabin flickered against the window behind them, and the sound of the mare shifting in the stall carried through the night. For the first time since Martha's death, Reed felt that tomorrow might not come as a burden, but as something worth meeting. 2 days after the mare's accident, Reed hitched his wagon for a supply run. Flour was running low, and the fence still needed nails to finish the last stretch. When he came outside, he found Nalin already lifting the empty sack into the bed of the wagon. She didn't ask if she could go. She simply moved with the certainty of someone who intended to stand beside him, whether the town liked it or not. "You don't have to," Reed said, adjusting the harness. Nalin met his eyes. "I won't hide in your house while they stare from the street. Better they see me now than imagine worse." Reed didn't argue, though a part of him wanted to. He knew she was right. The whispers would only grow louder if she remained unseen. Still, as they rode the 2 miles into Silver Creek, he felt the knot in his chest tighten with each turn of the wheels. The town was busy when they arrived. Wagons lined the street, children darted between boardwalks, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed across the yard. But the noise dulled when Reed's wagon rolled in. Heads turned. A woman in a dark dress pulled her daughter close. A man on the livery porch leaned forward, muttering something Reed couldn't hear but understood all the same. Nalin sat straight, her face calm, her eyes forward. She carried herself not with defiance, but with quiet endurance. Reed guided the wagon toward the general store, ignoring the stares. Inside, the storekeeper measured out flour and coffee. His hands moved stiffly, his eyes flicking to Nalin as if her presence disturbed the air itself. Reed set the money down hard enough to stop questions. 2 sacks, he said flatly. The man hesitated, then slid the goods across the counter. He didn't speak, but the silence was heavier than any insult. Reed carried the sacks out himself. Nalin followed, holding one under her arm with ease. On the boardwalk, Sheriff Pike stepped into their path. He had been waiting. His face was steady, though his eyes carried the weight of the counsel's words. "Morning, Reed." "Nalin." He spoke her name carefully, as if using it was part of his duty. "Morning," Reed answered, his tone even. Pike glanced at the townsfolk who had stopped to watch. He lowered his voice slightly. "Counsel wants me to remind you both. People are unsettled. They'd like to know how long this arrangement is lasting." Reed crossed his arms. "She's working for me. That's the length of it. They want it clear," Pike said. "Paper keeps order. It did before. It will again." Nalin shifted the sack against her hip. "I signed once already," she said. "How many times do they need to see my name before they stop pretending I'm a ghost?" Pike met her eyes, and for a brief second, Reed thought he saw respect there. "I'll hold them steady as long as I can," the sheriff said. "But you both need to understand, order in this town depends on perception as much as law, and perception turns faster than reason." Reed's jaw clenched, but he gave a sharp nod. Pike stepped aside, letting them pass. As they climbed back into the wagon, Nalin spoke quietly. "You're worried I'll bring more trouble than you can carry." Reed shook his head. "No, I'm worried this town will test us until we prove we're not leaving." They rode home in silence, the wagon creaking under the weight of supplies and unspoken thoughts. When they returned, Reed carried the sacks into the cabin. Nalin lingered by the corral, her hand resting lightly on the mare's neck. The horse shifted but did not pull away, the same trust she had shown days earlier. That evening, as they ate in the dim light of the stove, Reed finally asked the question that had lingered since she'd first mentioned her cousin. "If you find your kin, do you plan to leave?" Nalin looked across the table, her face calm but her voice steady. "I thought I would, but I've walked too many miles to believe in certainty. If I find a place where I can work and not be turned away, that's worth more than chasing what might already be gone." Reed absorbed her words. For years, he had lived with no intention of changing a single piece of his life. Now, here was someone who had no reason to stay, but was willing to. The weight of that choice settled heavy on him, but not in a way that felt unbearable. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. The town might keep talking, but in the quiet of that small room, Reed realized the question was no longer whether Nalin would stay. It was whether he was ready to admit he wanted her to. The days after their trip to town carried a different weight. Reed noticed it in the way neighbors lingered longer on the road past his property, in the silence that fell when he entered the store, and in the subtle shift of the blacksmith's tone when they spoke. No one had confronted him outright, but the air carried expectation. Silver Creek was waiting for him to choose whether Nalin's presence was temporary or permanent. Inside the cabin, the work continued without pause. Nalin rose early each morning, tending the mare's leg, sweeping the floor, cooking simple meals, and then moving out into the yard beside Reed. She hauled rails with him, set stones along the pasture line, and patched tack with neat stitches in the evenings. Reed found himself relying on her presence before he admitted it even to himself. A day without her hands moving across some piece of work now seemed incomplete. One evening as they ate, Reed finally broke the silence that had been building between them. "You've been here long enough to see how things stand. They'll keep watching you, waiting to see if you leave." Nalin looked at him steadily. "And you? Are you waiting for me to leave?" The question hit him squarely. For months, he had lived with the certainty of being alone. Even when she first arrived, he thought of her stay as a passing thing, a moment of decency that would end once she moved on. But now, staring at her across the table with the firelight catching her features, he realized the thought of her leaving sat in his chest like a stone. "I was," he admitted, "at first, but not anymore." Her expression did not change much, but her eyes softened. She set her fork down and folded her hands. "You lost someone, and the town has been keeping you in that grief. They see you as a man who stopped living. And me," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "they see me as a reminder of every fight they never got over. If I stay here, it won't just be work we're choosing. It will be standing against all of that together." Reed leaned back, the truth of her words heavy but undeniable. "I know." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I don't care what they say. I care if you want this place to be yours too." Nalin studied him in the silence that followed. Her life had been nothing but moving from place to place, never settling, never being welcomed. The fire crackled behind them as she considered his words. "If I stay, it will not be as a hired hand or a guest. I won't carry water for a man's pride. If I stay, it will be as a partner." Reed's chest tightened at the clarity of her voice. He thought of Martha then, of the years they had built together, and for the first time he felt no guilt at imagining a future beyond that loss. He nodded slowly. "Then partner it is." The next morning, the decision was put to its first test. A group of townsfolk rode out toward Reed's land, 2 ranchers and the storekeeper among them. They stopped by the corral, their expressions cautious but sharp. Reed met them at the gate, Nalin standing at his side. The storekeeper spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of gossip turned to demand. "Reed, folks are saying this arrangement isn't right. She doesn't belong here." Reed's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Nalin spoke. Her tone was calm, but her words left no space for dismissal. "I work this land same as him. I mend, I build, I care for the animals. If you want to say I don't belong, then you're saying the work itself has no place here." The ranchers shifted uneasily. They weren't prepared for her to answer directly. Reed stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "This is my land, my house, and my choice. If anyone here has a problem, they could take it up with me, not her." For a long moment, no one spoke. The men looked at each other, weighing the risk of pressing further. Finally, the storekeeper muttered something under his breath and turned his horse back toward town. The others followed, leaving fresh tracks in the dirt road. When the sound of hooves faded, Reed exhaled slowly. Nalin glanced at him. "You've tied yourself to me now, whether you meant to or not." Reed shook his head. "No, I meant to." That night, the cabin felt different. Not only because of what had been said and done, but because the choice had been made aloud. Whatever came from the town, they had declared themselves, not as strangers sharing a roof, but as 2 people who had claimed the same piece of ground. The silence that followed carried no fear. It carried the weight of commitment, steady and final. The confrontation at the corral left its mark, But instead of dividing them, it set the course of what came next. The townsfolk had made their doubts plain, and Reed had answered them with his choice. There was no turning back from that. Nalin remained in the cabin, not as a guest, not as a temporary hand, but as someone who had claimed her place by word and by work. In the days that followed, life took on a steady rhythm. The mare's leg healed under Nalin's careful tending, the swelling receding until she could walk evenly again. Reed saw how the animal trusted her touch more than his own, and though it stung at first, it also brought him relief. He had always feared losing that mare. Now he knew she was safe. Together, they finished mending the corral, patched the shed roof, and planted a row of seed in the small garden plot near the side of the house. Nalin suggested changes Reed had never considered. Where to place stones so rain would flow toward the soil, how to braid strips of cloth to keep birds away. She wasn't only helping him keep the ranch alive, she was shaping it for the future. Reed noticed other changes as well. He had once avoided the store, the saloon, and even Sunday gatherings, too weighed down by Martha's absence. But when Nalin suggested walking the fence line together through town's side, he didn't hesitate. People still stared, but the stares began to soften, turning from sharp judgment to quiet observation. The sheriff, true to his word, kept the peace. When talk grew heated in the saloon one evening, Pike stepped in before it could travel further, reminding folks that what a man did on his land was his business. That settled more than one argument. One crisp morning, Reed took out the paper Sheriff Pike had written weeks before, the one naming Nalin as a worker of the Walker place. He laid it on the table, staring at her name written in the sheriff's hand. Then he looked across at Nalin, who was braiding rope with quick, practiced motions. "This says worker," he said quietly. "But that's not what you are. Not anymore." Nalin set the rope aside. She watched him carefully, sensing the weight of his words. "Then what am I?" Reed took a long breath, his hand resting on the paper. "You're the one who kept this place standing when I couldn't. The one who walked through a town that shut every door and still held your head high. I don't want you listed here as someone passing through. I want you listed here as family." The silence stretched between them, steady and heavy. Then Nalin rose, crossed the room, and stood in front of him. "If I choose to stay," she said, "I choose all of it. The work, the stairs, the weight. Not as a shadow, not as someone half accepted. If we do this, we do it fully." Reed nodded, his jaw set, but his eyes softer than they had been in years. "Then we'll do it fully." The following week, they went to the sheriff's office together. Papers were signed again, this time different. Their names recorded not as employer and worker, but as husband and wife. Pike witnessed it himself, and the storekeeper, pulled in from the boardwalk, stood as second. The act was simple, but binding, and when they left, the weight of doubt no longer hung over them. On the ride back to the ranch, Reed noticed the change. People still looked, but fewer turned away. A child waved from the boardwalk, and Nalin lifted her hand in return. The town had not forgotten its prejudice, but the sharpness of it had dulled. Paper had turned whispers into something more settled, something people would now learn to live with. At the ranch, they set about their days with a new steadiness. The mare grazed calmly in the corral, the pump ran smooth, and the shed roof held against the next gust of wind. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, the fields stretching before them, the sky wide and clear. Reed no longer carried the silence like a burden. It had become something shared, something that no longer reminded him of loss, but instead reminded him of presence. One bright afternoon, as the sun stood high overhead, Reed reached into the Bible on the shelf and pulled out the $3 bills Nalin had first offered him at his door. The edges were still wrinkled, the paper worn. He held them out to her. "These started it," he said. Nalin took them, looked at them for a moment, and shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "You started it, by opening the door." She placed the bills back on the table. "Keep them." A reminder that sometimes what seems small becomes everything. Reed didn't argue. He set the bills back where they had rested for weeks. He knew she was right. By the first frost, the cabin no longer felt like a place half frozen in memory. It felt lived in again, shaped by two people who had chosen to stay, not out of desperation, but out of will. The town, in time, adjusted. The gossip faded. And on Sundays, Reed and Nalin walked the fence line together, their steps in rhythm, their silence steady. Not empty, not heavy, but whole. The story that had begun with a desperate knock and $3 wrinkled closed not with questions, but with certainty. They had built something worth keeping. And for the first time in years, Reed Walker could look at tomorrow without dread, knowing he was no longer facing it alone.